Good evening. How is everyone doing? Yeah, that's one thumbs up. I'll take it. My name's Phelan Johnson. I'm an artistic associate here at Harbourfront Centre working on Planet IndigenUS, amongst many other things. And I just wanted to take a chance to welcome you to our partnership between the power plant and Planet IndigenUS. We're delighted to be taking part in this partnership. It's really exciting for us and I think really important. I think art and politics travel very closely together, and so this event is really a perfect fit for our wheelhouse. I'd like to take a moment to thank you and to welcome you to the land that we're on, which is the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, as well as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or the Six Nations of the Grand River, as they are sometimes called. Now, I would like to just remind you to pick up one of these if you don't have one in your hand. They just let you know what's going on for the weekend. It's going to be a very busy week here down at Harbourfront for Planet IndigenUS, so please do come and check that out. I am going to ask you not to use your phones. I believe no pictures, no videos, none of that stuff. And now I would like to introduce Christine Bowen, who is the Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant.
Thank you, Phelan. I too want to welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight. I know that there's so much going on with the Planet IndigenUS Festival, and so we really appreciate your choosing to be part of this very important conversation with us this evening. And just to let you know that the panel presentation itself will begin with a conversation amongst our panelists, and then we will open the floor up for conversation with our audience members. We are recording the conversation for our archives and ultimately to present on our online platforms, and so please wait for the handheld mic when you have a question or a comment, and we really encourage your participation because we'd like everybody's voices to be part of this important discussion. So this Oil and Water panel presentation is co-presented with Planet IndigenUS. I would like to thank our program partners at Planet IndigenUS, especially Melanie Hernandez, Janice Montour, and Phelan Johnson for working with us in producing tonight's program, as well as all of our partners at Harbourfront Centre. I would also like to thank the Power Plant's primary education sponsor, CIBC, for their ongoing generous support of all of our education and public programs, as well as the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, the Toronto Arts Council, and OCAF. And please know that our all-year, all-free access to our exhibitions are generously supported by BMO. Most importantly, I would like to thank Ombaasin Collective for curating tonight's event, as well as conducting a performance at the Power Plant on Saturday as part of the Planet IndigenUS Festival. Ombaasin is a collective of First Nation word and image warriors committed to innovative programming that builds community and helps the arts grow through spaces of experimentation and exchange. And both of the programs that they're doing with the Power Plant are an example of this. And we're very appreciative to them for this. Ombaasin means to be lifted by the wind in Anishinaabemowin, and its members include Wanda Nanibush, Elwood Jimmy, and Brian Norton, all of whom participated in bringing this event together. Brian Norton is an Anishinaabe-Frenchimnissing First Nation with a passion for supporting the arts and promoting environmental responsibility through active involvement in the community.
Right back there by the camera.
Elwood Jimmy is originally from Thunderchild First Nation in northwestern Saskatchewan and works in Toronto as a curator, programmer, writer, cultural manager, and artist.
Woo. And Elwood Jimmy is right there.
And Wanda Nanibush is an Anishinaabe Cree image and word warrior who is Quay, sorry.
It's a little too close to
Pardon me. Who has organized for Idle No More. She has taught and written on the history of Indigenous women's resistances. Currently, she is a guest curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, writing a book on Indigenous women's resistance to violence and finishing a film called A Love Letter to My People. She is a member of both Soleil First Nation and lives on her people's territory. So I now turn the floor over to Wanda, who will introduce tonight's panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Anine, Bojo, Sago, Wache. I guess I could say bonjour as well. I don't know why I did it that way, but it just sounded, just felt it somehow tonight. I did have a baby with a French guy, maybe that's why. So I'm really happy you all came, and I'm really happy that Eriel and Amanda have come. And I'm going to introduce them first, and then introduce what we're going to do tonight. So right here is Eriel Seekwe, Deranger. She is the communications manager of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation of Alberta. She is one of the most powerful and tireless activists working to resist the fossil fuel industry's immense extractive operations in Alberta's tar sands. This causes devastation to our people's ancestral homelands in the boreal forest around Lake Athabasca, to the world community and the global biosphere already in the throes of climate change-induced cataclysms. Eriel has organized demonstrations and campaigns, initiated lawsuits, traveled the world speaking to audiences, including at the UN, to defend her people's right to survive and the fragile ecosystems and wildlife habitat of northern forests at risk of annihilation, as well as the very future of the life on this planet. So Eriel, welcome.
Sounds like a really, really dramatic bio. I'm not that dramatic.
We'll see. And then we have Amanda Lickers. Turtle Clan, Onondaga, Haudenosaunee, is a spoken word poet, filmmaker, and curator for Reclaim Turtle Island. Amanda spends her time fanning the flames of the Indigenous insurrection, supporting grassroots land defense and sovereignty struggles, currently based in, Goyogiage? No, Joyagiage. Okay, Montreal. Based in the Joyagiage occupied Gayengehaga territory. She organizes against land exploitation projects that threaten the health of her territories, like Line 9 and the Energy East. She recently released her first short film, co-produced with submedia.tv, titled Gayensa Close, a short on Indigenous resistance to tar sands pipelines in Northeast Turtle Island. So welcome, Amanda. I also want to acknowledge the territory on which we sit tonight, the traditional territory of the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron or Wendat, the Seneca specifically as well, and the Anishinaabe. And it's a very complicated history, a layered history, and Toronto's boundaries include a lot of nations. Mm-hmm. And I think importantly also want to acknowledge the 60 to 90,000 Indigenous people who currently call Toronto their home, that come from many nations. And I also want to acknowledge the territory of Canada as all Indigenous territory that we share with all the nations that have come here. So I'm going to welcome all of you. So tonight we're talking about oil and water. And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking about the fact that we fight against oil to a certain extent in defense of water. So there's a connection there between our long-standing fight to protect the water and what happened when the Navigational Waters Protection Act was sort of released from protection majority of the rivers and lakes in Canada. And people were looking ahead and knowing that releasing those waters from protection meant opening them to the extraction economy. So that's somewhere we knew what was coming. We also knew the extraction economy wasn't a good choice, which we've been seeing, which we can talk about as well tonight. The other thought I was thinking is like when you put oil in water, I was like thinking about the ways in which Indigenous philosophies and ways of being, when we try to communicate that to industry and the government, our current government, that supports it, it's kind of like a body of water trying to absorb an oil spill. sort of how it can feel. So I had that image in my mind. So some of the things that we want to talk about is the way in which an oil spill is actually a treaty issue or a constitutional issue, not just an environmental issue. And I think we'll get a little bit into the differences of putting Indigenous rights and inherent title to the land at the forefront and how that might change the way an environmental movement might operate. And we also want to talk about the connections between violence against the land and violence against women. So that is some of the topics that you will be hearing about tonight. I think also about water, and as an Anishinaabe woman, we're thought of as caretakers of the water, and the water itself is a female spirit. And I've been eternally inspired by the women water walkers. And they're walking, but they're also participating in a ceremony, and that ceremony is meant to heal the water. And this has been going on for, about a decade now. And we participated in this water ceremony here in Toronto, and we're going to do another water ceremony on Saturday between 1 and 5 at the power plant, led by Pauline Shirt. And when I was participating in that ceremony, we were thinking about Lake Ontario. And Lake Ontario, the water walkers say, is the heaviest lake of all, which means it's the most polluted. And to carry it, it's like really, really heavy. So you can imagine what's in it. And as I was looking out, we were looking out to the east because you go to all the directions. And I was looking out to the east, and then underneath, all I could feel was this really large, I don't know, I think it was like a fish, bird type thing under tons and tons and layers of dirt and sand and soot. And it was just kind of like it was struggling to move, but as we were doing the ceremony, it was everything on top of it was getting looser and looser and looser. And then we started this braiding project, which is part of what tonight's about. And the first day of braiding, was the blue moon, what non-Native people call the blue moon, we call the big spirit moon. And the spirit helper of that moon is a sturgeon. And so it was sort of all kind of connecting, and our elder was talking about how the sturgeon are coming back. The more that they do these water walks, they can feel the sturgeon coming back, the ancient sturgeon, the large sturgeon. So all these things are connected. And so when we talk about oil and industry, we're also talking about these spirits that are deeply important to life itself. And water is the lifeblood of our Mother Earth. And it's also our lifeblood. We can't frickin' live without it. So in a sense, it comes down to life, a question of life. So I just want to say a couple of those things while we open up. And I want to turn to Eriel first. And I know recently, maybe you could introduce your territory and say a little bit about what's been going on there, and then we'll get into some other stuff.
Iklanete, Sazi, Eriel Tsekwe Deranger Ta, Masucho. So my name is Eriel Tsekwe Deranger, and I just greeted you in my language, which is Dene or Dene Sutlene. So my people are the Kaitale Dene Sutlene, our colonial name, and not just like European colonial, but our people were sort of colonized by the Cree a little bit. So the name Chipwayan is a Cree word. But our people's actual name is Kaitale Dene Sutlene. We were given the name Chipwayan. I don't even know how to say it. It's Cree. It doesn't matter to me. We belong to Treaty Number 8. So Treaty Number 8 is the largest numbered treaty area in all of Canada. And the Treaty 8 territory spans through much of northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, and northern British Columbia. Is quite a large territory. And so the Dene people, or the Dene Sutlene people, which Dene Sutlene means people of the land, Kaitale refers to our specific, now I'm speaking American tribe, our nation, and Kaitale is the delta, so it means people of the willow, and it refers to the Athabasca Delta. So my people, our traditional territory is within the Athabasca Delta region, Peace Athabasca Delta. So my family, I live in Alberta now, but my family actually, our trap line and my family's trap line extended from Alberta, northern Alberta, into Saskatchewan, all along the shores of Lake Athabasca. So that's where my territory is, and it also happens to be the heart of the largest industrial project on the planet, which is also known as the tar sands. And the reason that the tar sands is the largest industrial project on the planet isn't because of the extraction itself, but because of the immense infrastructure that is associated with it. It's not just simply, some mines and some operations to pump out oil, which is not conventional oil, but it's actually a series of pipelines to deliver the oil, rail systems to deliver the oil, heavy haul trucks, as well as pipelines to bring natural gas and diluent and solvents to our territory to help process this. And so it's an immense operation, and it takes an immense amount of capital, an immense amount of energy, like energy in the sense of they use natural gas, which is a cleaner burning source of fuel, to extract a heavy, dirty fuel known as bitumen or tar sands, and an immense amount of water. For every barrel that they extract of tar sands, they use between 2 to 4 barrels of fresh water from the Athabasca River system, which is the heart of our community for numerous reasons, not just because we can't live without water, but because the community of Fort Chipewyan, where my people reside, is downstream from the development, and it's a remote community. It's about 1,200 people, and it's a fly-in, fly-out community, or boat-in, boat-out community, meaning that the river system is not just simply what brings us our water, but it also brings our people to and from. It also brings animals and fish and everything to us. And they are not just degrading the river system by the flow, but they are also contaminating these systems. And I'm sure a lot of pipeline conversations have come up, but in our territory, if you see a map of Alberta, we have more pipelines over the area of land than any other place in the country. And we have a pipeline spill, burst, or rupture we have 2 a day in the province, 2 a day.
I'm going to ask Amanda to also kind of introduce yourself from your own mouth rather than this bio, and your territory and where you're coming from with your activism as well.
Yeah, sure. Sego Sego Guego, Amanda Lickers Yenjets, Yade Wagadir Yonderdit, Sini Waxanoda, Nokohoe Neha, Denogin Yodo, Nigarina Rondo, Onanduaga Hodnashoni. I currently live in Jotjage, as a place of a broken circle. It's like a so-called Montreal, the island, like islands, rivers, these nexus places are really important for like many Indigenous nations to have big gatherings, and so there's like a certain energy there. But I happen to find myself in the place of the broken circle. And anyway, I belong to the Turtle Clan of the Seneca, so-called Seneca. We self-reference as Onondaga, which is people of the Great Hill, and Haudenosaunee building the Longhouse. And so I grew up, actually, like, my family is from Six Nations of the Grand River, but I grew up in like a rural context, like in so-called Prince Edward County, and which is like near Belleville and like Tyendinaga, Mohawk territory. And it's actually interesting, like, coming to understand like my own pull to like the water and to water issues, like as like in relationship to my clan responsibilities, and then also like coming now at this point in my life, like learning more about our creation story and the sacred sites that I grew up near that I didn't even know were like really important to our people, and just like yeah, and so that's kind of been a really interesting part of my own personal development and understanding what does it mean to be Ongahoe, to be like people from the land, and to have like ancestral relationships and like literally ancestors in the land, like, and that as Haudenosaunee too, like we are mound like do ritual burial mounds, you know, and so like literally the shape of the earth, you know, comes from our relationships with our ancestors and with our relatives. And so anyway, so in all these kinds of ways, I've like been really driven in the last, you know, I guess I've been organizing, you know, I guess like this or whatever, probably just like the last 5 years. I'm like gonna be 26 and in October. And yeah, I don't know, I just feel like such an extreme imperative, you know, because it's so overwhelming, you know, like the violence of colonial capitalism and like, and the occupation, the settler colonial occupation is so normalized, like we don't see it. You know, I recently had the honor to go to Philistine, so-called Israel and Palestine, and like seeing the context in Palestine really helped me to kind of rip some layers and see how, because they always were talking about this every day. They're like, we have to stop, we have to prevent the normalization of the occupation. We have to prevent the normalization of occupation. And I realized that's like our work in reverse. We have to undo that, you know? And so like earlier we met and we were kind of like talking about some of the things we're gonna talk about tonight. And it's just, you know, situations are complex and fraught. You know, the political landscape is difficult to navigate because there's all of these different factors to come into play in terms of like people's real lived experiences and the affects, the intergenerational affects, you know, but also like the material affects of colonization and contact. And so anyway, so like personally, I'm trying to just take a harm reduction approach and like trying on some things and like meeting meeting with our Grand Council about like the water systems and how we're going to be impacted in the event of like, obviously in the inevitability of pipeline ruptures in this area, you know. And it's intense because the water system, I mean, the Great Lakes literally is the largest source of fresh water on the earth, but like, let's just build pipelines right beside it because that is the logic of colonial capitalism, because like, why not, you know? Yeah, and so I've been lately, like the last couple of years, I actually got brought into media justice work and working in film and using documentary as a way to not only increase narrative, like, or increase awareness, but also to like establish strong narratives about solutions and how to move forward and try to create resources like within our own communities about how to organize and also to see each other do that work, you know? And so I started working in documentary filmmaking and alongside with supporting, you know, direct action-based struggles and a lot of the time like land reclamation projects, you know, like where people are trying to take back their territory when they can, because yeah, not everyone can just go drink their water again. Yeah, so it's a little bit about me. And I'm just really honored to be here with, you know, with Eriel and Wanda. You know, these two women these two Yeyadases are people who I really respect and have seen their work and have been inspired by, you know, and it's really intense being, you know, sometimes an Indigenous woman and the ways in which organizing spaces can feel, you know, and to see, you know, strong women like doing what they can and what they need to do for their communities is like, you know, endlessly inspiring. So I'm just like grateful, you know, you know.
Miigwech. Yeah, I want to go further on the oil spill thing, but I was sitting up, I went for a long trip in northern Manitoba, and they've had since 1970s dealing with Manitoba hydro and dams, you know, so alternative energy is not always so great either. But just thinking about talking to these elders and trappers, and they were taking me out on the land and showing like, this has all been clear cut so the animals aren't here anymore, or this has all been flooded. Our water, you know, no longer will there be a generation of children who will even know what clean water is in that territory or even able to fish and trap the way they used to. It's actually gone because of what Hydro-Quebec did, or Hydro-Manitoba did. Whoops.
Same.
BC Hydro's next. But this is, for them, it connected, I was thinking it connects to what you were just saying, where it's actually about, it's not just about, you know, water is life kind of thinking, it's actually, in the entire way of life is sort of tied into this, and that is a protected treaty right. So if you could further that discussion.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing because, you know, tar sands activism has become like the big sexy in the environmental movement over the past 5 years. And there's this push of like, no tar sands because it's so destructive, and there's this disconnect as to what that destruction actually equates to, particularly for frontline communities that exist within these areas where this destruction is actually happening. And I think most recently in northern Alberta, just south of Fort McMurray, southeast of Fort McMurray, there was the largest oil pipeline spill in Canadian history. So 5 million liters of raw bitumen, and while processed, they don't really know the extent, they're still trying to determine what it was, but 5 million liters of bitumen in some sort of form was spilled into the Delta region. And they think that it actually had been going on for a couple of weeks before they caught it. Now, there are two things that make this relevant and to why this spill should be very concerning to people. This is this pipeline that was 2 years old. This is a company that claimed it had the best technology, the best sourced materials, that they would not see a spill, and if they did, it would be minimal. A pipeline spill went undetected for potentially weeks into the Delta. Now, when the spill was announced to the public through the Alberta Energy Regulator, they really tried to downplay the impacts. They said, don't worry, public, it was nowhere near the water. But in actuality, the Delta in that region is one ecosystem. It's not some sort of, there's a lake over here, and there's a city over here, and there's a forest here. The systems are all interconnected to one another. And the Delta is a unique place. Delta is a very diverse, biodiverse region that has bogs or marshes and peat moss, and our people call it muskeg. Every time I say muskeg, no one knows what I'm talking about. But our people, some people do, I don't know. But muskeg is basically like peat moss, and it's very, very dense in this region. The muskeg is so deep and so big that machinery disappears in it. Like big trucks will get sucked into the muskeg. It has taken thousands and thousands of years to become as lush and developed as it has. There's no way to reclaim the muskeg. The muskeg is an important part of the ecosystem. It helps filter water through the groundwater systems that feed into the lakes and river systems in the region. It is where many animals take to calve and feed their young. There are berry patches, medicine patches, everything you could possibly imagine that is used for sustenance and cultural preservation of the local people. And the government said, don't worry, it was just in a bunch of muskeg. Now, that was it was a kind of like this eye-opening moment where people in the province were like, oh, that's good. It's not near any water source. It's not going to affect me. But in actuality, it's a violation of our rights. These are our traditional territories where our people were promised through the treaties that we signed. And the treaties, again, are nation-to-nation agreements that were made between First Nation leaders and the leaders and minions. That was me, okay. The agents of the crown. And this was supposed to be an agreement about the sharing of the land. And as a part of that agreement, there was a promise that we would be able to access our traditional territories for hunting, fishing, gathering, cultural procurement, that we would have a say in the management and control over our lands and how they would be used in the future. That hasn't happened the way it's supposed to. And when we see degradation to our ecosystems, it is simply shrugged off because it is of no value to colonial white society. But what it equates to is a degradation of our rights, of a contractual obligation that was signed by our by our ancestors, your ancestors and my ancestors. The colonizers of this country and the First Nation leaders came to this agreement, and it has been broken time and time again. And you can't simply say, oh, it's just the muskeg. That muskeg feeds into the water systems. What are going to be the long-term impacts? How are they going to reclaim that area? Because you can't. The only way to clean muskeg is to simply remove it. I don't know that the communities in that region want to see the removal into the muskeg region. This is an area where medicines are picked, berries are picked, animals are hunted, fished, and trapped. There's no roads to this region, so it's out of sight, out of mind for everyone else. And this is just one incident. A scientist, a researcher named Dr. Timoney did a sort of an analysis in the region. And since 1997, there have been close to 5,000 different incidents in just this region around Fort McMurray alone. Close to 5,000 incidents, which is 5,000 different incidences which contribute to the degradation and the abrogation of treating Aboriginal rights, the degradation of our abilities to access our traditional territories, the degradation of the ecosystems which keep our species alive, whether it's flora and fauna, whether it's medicines, berries, elk, caribou, bison, fish, duck, you name it. Our people don't simply use these things as recreation either. In my community of Fort Chipewyan, being in a rural community, hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering is about survival. Even in 2015, it is about survival. There's one grocery store. It's called the Northern Store. A loaf of Wonder Bread, depending on the time of the year, is $6 to $8. A gallon of milk runs between $12 to $16. It's much cheaper to buy a 2-liter of Coke and a bag of chips. Can you imagine what the diets of our communities look like? Almost everyone's freezer in that community is filled with wild game. It is used to subsidize the cost of living. It is used to be able to keep continuing to put food on the table. And the choice is pretty simple when you go to the grocery store and a shriveled up pepper costs $5. Or you can go out hunting for the day and get some duck and some moose and some caribou and some bison and whatever else. But the security of our communities is being shattered because of the industrialization of our traditional territory and the degradation via the industrialization. And people are scared to continue these lifestyles. They're scared because cancers are increasing at a rate that is unacceptable. And there's nothing being done about it. And you don't even want to start talking about, well, talk to the government about it, because we have. Government's doing nothing. Our current leadership, federally and provincially, has done nothing about environmental oversight and regulations in the region. And the cost, the ultimate cost, is that the Kaital Dene Sutlane, the Mikisew Cree, the Fort Mackay First Nation, the Fort McMurray or the Anzac Cree First Nation, and all the Métis settlements in that region, our culture, our rights, who we are as people who is intrinsically tied to those ecosystems will disappear with the landscapes. And that's the bottom line. It's cultural and environmental genocide.
That's right.
Yep.
Are you feeling that in your body? One of the things I was thinking while you were talking is, like in the Manitoba region, because they've been dealing with it since the 70s, I come back to it because their fishery and their trapping, like on average, their salaries a year were over $40,000 a year. So entirely self-sufficient, entirely, able to both take care of the land and take care of themselves and their families and their communities. And then you have hydro come in, and majority of that hydro goes to the States, not to Canadians. And now majority of the community is on welfare, not because of their choice. They did not choose that. And there is a deep connection between colonization and poverty and land. There's a really great book out that just came out by Arthur Art Manuel. And he makes a connection between how much land Indigenous people currently occupy, which is less than 2% of all Canadian territory, and our poverty levels, which is almost 99%. So there's also that, right? You can be self-sufficient, and then suddenly if the land is destroyed and all that, then also your self-sufficiency goes with that. And then the trolls on the internet will blame you for it. Amanda, I wondered if you could connect what we're talking about to the Energy East and Line 9, because I know you've done a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, totally.
And this is right here, too. So.
Yeah. I actually was gonna pull up we were gonna have photos, and I was gonna show actually a map of Line 9 in the city of Toronto, just so people who live in Toronto can visualize it, because one of the most important things to like, as you were saying earlier, Eriel, like the tar sands, it's not just because of the mining and extraction.
Bend it down a little and then it will.
Yeah, it's not just because of like mining and extraction, but it's because of the entire infrastructure that it's such a like industrial, like a giga project, as they say, and like that's part of the context that like I think people need to visualize when we look at pipelines and the impacts of pipelines, because it's not just about transporting bitumen from point A to point B. It's about expanding tar sands like capacity, so that way there can be more development into the future, and so that there's a way to get their product to market, so that way this industry can try to maintain an illusion of economic viability. But on top of the expansion aspect, there's so much infrastructure that's necessary in order just to like have the pipelines do what they do. There's pumping stations, there's refineries, and there's the end product. But also in the context of the Energy East, they're going to build a marine terminal in St. John's, New Brunswick, in occupied Wolastoq territory, so-called Maliseet Nation, is their like colonial name. And and so that means that there's going to be super tankers actually that are going to be transporting and docking it up on the super rocky East Coast. So that puts the entire eastern seaboard in danger in the event of any kind of spill or accident or whatever the situation may be. And the reality is, like, environmental monitoring, it doesn't matter, it doesn't really, it's not gonna, like, we in the Line 9 campaign, we talk a lot about the Kalamazoo spill, because it's owned by Enbridge, it's pretty much a very similar pipe, it's a similar age, similar size, and it was a conventional oil pipeline that was then converted in order to be able to carry diluted bitumen, Line 6A, and even the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, which is the federal regulatory body in the US, they're still hounding Enbridge. Kalamazoo, that was 5 years ago now, that was in 2010. It is 2015,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay. Just checking.
What year are we in?
And there's still, like, this federal regulatory body is still hounding Enbridge to clean up the bitumen in the Kalamazoo River. And so people in the, like in the Line 9 struggle, like we reference this to be like, this is the standard, this is the corporate standard for accountability that we can hope for, which is absolutely none, And like we think like that, oh, it's it's a pipeline and it's it's in the ground, it'll be okay. But the reality is, like, whether it's the Don River, or whether it's going through like the Trent Severn water system, or even if it's coming to like the head of the St. Lawrence River, that all flows back into Lake Ontario and the Great Lakes water system. And as well as a Haudenosaunee woman, it also impacts the health of the Finger Lakes region. And Lake Onondaga is not in a good way. It's one of the most toxic sites in North America, actually. And it's just like unfettered industrialization that allows this to happen. And so when we're thinking about these things in like cultural erasure, because in the East it's a lot different than in the West. The resistance and the history of colonization and the affects of contact are like extremely different. Can you
describe some of those differences?
Yeah, sure. So for instance, like I'd say it's a mixed bag as to whether or not we do have territory that is livable, but it's not so much in the central regions, and like when we look at the context of like our friend Vanessa Gray in Aamjiwnaang and the so-called Chemical Valley in Sarnia, this is like major old industrial zones, well, contemporary, but they have a legacy there, and we have hyper-popularized urban regions, like we have really old infrastructure in terms of like nuclear facilities, in terms of even just the lock and dam system alone as a tool of colonization, as a means to get colonial ships further inland, but also B, in order to like functionally like re-landscape our traditional territories. And this impacts not only our lifeways, but our entire identities. When we have a lot of water clans aren't as recognized anymore, because we don't have, like you're talking about doing water ceremony, bringing back the sturgeon, that is really real. Like that connection is really real. I was recently like reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer, and in it, she talks about how when people harvest sweetgrass population actually thrives. So like the indigenous relationship between the land, where we are actually able to like gain our sustenance and our cultural and political identities, and that actually is a reciprocal relationship. It's not just a taking, like in a colonial mind frame, right? And so the reality is, and this is like, I talked to my O'odham friends, my friends I have some friends down in so-called Arizona. They have the U.S.-Mexico border crosses right through their territory. They live in the Sonora Desert, and they have water issues. I talk with my O'odham friends, my Diné friends, and they're like, Amanda, what's water issues like for you guys? Because they live in a context of drought, and it's a desert. You don't just go and drink water. And I joke, like, because they pray every time, like they give acknowledgments every time they see like a puddle or something, because it's really uncommon. And one of my friends was up here, I'm like, you'll be stopping every 2 seconds, But like, you literally won't be able to get anywhere if you're doing that. But but the context here is like, we can see all of this water and like and feel like we can access this water, but we can't actually be in the water. We can't actually really go swimming in a lot of places. We can't drink the water. Like, it's not safe. We have mad contamination, Like the St. Lawrence River, I was recently, we had the reading of the Great Law in Aguasasne, and I was there, and there's this like water testing facility that has all of these caution, nuclear, like radioactive. So they're testing the St. Lawrence for how much is it being affected, and probably by things like Gentilly, which is a nuclear facility in Quebec along the St. Lawrence River, and things like this. So people, it's just like, it's amazing how invisibilized it is, and sometimes it takes like the images, like there was a pipe spill in Burnaby not too long ago, and it's like images of a suburban house, a suburban street, and then there's all this oil slick, and people can't go to work and all this kind of stuff. And so people, I feel like it's really important that we try to take action now and like get informed about these projects and find out what is happening, how is the tar sands expanding, what does that actually mean for water in so-called Ontario or Quebec, what does that mean for Lake Ontario, and in this context of like increased, how did you put it, climate catastrophe? Something brilliant like that. And in this context, like you have the whole West Coast or central western region is on fire, and like there's an extreme drought situation. So water is becoming even more of a tense situation in terms of like access and privatization, and even in urban contexts like in Detroit, when we talk about genocide, when we talk about apartheid, like through the reservation system, that also happens in context of black community, and that's exactly what's happening in Detroit. They're refusing to take any action, and they're just allowing people, literally pregnant mothers, anybody, to just have their water cut off. And the reason that they're doing it is because they want to gentrify the neighborhood, clear out a majority black city, and bring in white affluence. And just like we were talking about the relationship between, hunting and gathering is about survivance, and when they poison the lands, they're actually poisoning our people, and that's part of, like, as you said, a cultural and like, direct cultural and environmental genocide. And so it is part of this ongoing ethnic cleansing. And that's what people don't really, I feel like, doesn't sit with folks. It's like you think, okay, I'm using my propane stove. I live in downtown Toronto. I'm just gonna cook some eggs, with that blue flame. But that blue flame comes from fracking. And like the amount of violence that's associated with fracking alone, like whether it's against the earth, and we're gonna get into violence against women as well, but like through the man camps, like the amount of physical and sexual violence that are faced by Indigenous women at disproportionate like levels in those contexts is just astronomical, and it's whether you're in the southwestern United States or whether you're in Pennsylvania or whether you're in Quebec or New Brunswick, wherever the frack attack is happening, you have irreparable water damage in, like the water table is literally cracked open, and you're using, and there's like all kinds of solvents and other heavy chemicals that have been like pumped into the water table. Y'all have probably seen the water on fire, and so we need to like connect these things and not have them feel so dispersed, like this is actually literally about ethnic cleansing. This is about who's a desirable settler in the Canadian project in Harper's Canada, but it'll be Trudeau's Canada or whoever's Canada. It's still gonna be the same project of ethnic cleansing that has started since contact, So I hope there you go, that's a little.
I just want to jump in there for a sec with the Kalamazoo Just saying, for those who don't know, that was a spill in 2010, one of the largest in North America, that happened in Michigan from Enbridge. And the spill that happened in your territory was by Nexen, which is a Chinese-owned company, and that spill is larger than Kalamazoo. And it's like the pipes there were double-walled, it's like extra protection, and also, I think the other part of that was important is that the detection system failed. So it's actually a worker who found it. He was just walking along and saw the spill. That's the only reason that they found it. So that's kind of where it's at.
And just some people that don't understand the difference between crude oil or tar sands oil or Bakken shale oil versus sweet synthetic crude oil is the difference in the properties, the makeup of the oil, and why it becomes so dangerous and why it should be a concern to everyone. Is that it's not your sweet conventional oil. It's not your like pump jack oil. Like in order to extract it, it involves highly destructive removal of ecosystems, like actual physical 100% removal of ecosystems, but then they just dig it out of the ground, or they use another system called in situ or SAGD, which is steam assisted gravity drainage, which is kind of like fracking on crack, in my opinion, because like 80% of the tar sands will be accessed through in situ or SAGD, highly water intensive, highly energy intensive, but the byproduct that they pull out of the ground that they're shipping through these pipelines is called dilbit. Or diluted bitumen. And diluted bitumen is not oil. It does not move like oil. It moves like peanut butter, okay? This is like a thick, highly like corrosive oil. It's filled with still different types of heavy metals, chemical composition. It's highly corrosive, and it doesn't just sit on the top of water in the way that sort of conventional oil does. A lot of it sinks to the bottom, and it sits there. And there's no way to clean the bottom of these lakes or water systems unless you dredge them, which then actually really compromises the entire ecosystem of that body of water. So Kalamazoo is still dealing with like, how are they actually going to clean this 5 years later, and there's still like basically a lot of dilbit sitting at the bottom of the Kalamazoo River. And so these industries like Nexen and whoever else, TransCanada, Enbridge, they're all saying, oh no, we're going to use way better materials. We're going to use double walled. We're going to like put in these like great systems that are going to like detect it. Don't worry, there's not going to be a spill. And they keep saying, no, the likelihood of a spill is so low. 2 years, Nexen, largest spill in Canadian history.
North
American history, okay?
Inland, yeah.
That should not give anyone a peace of mind. And what does that have to do with fracking? Actually, all of this is interconnected because of the fact of fracking. Natural gas that they're getting from the fracking industry is going to be used to power the tar sands. So we're going to take another heavy, dirty fuel source, and then we're going to use it to power all the in situ plants so that we can get oil. The communities are suffering, frontline communities, even small rural communities like settler communities. Are we getting any of this energy? Such a small percentage of this energy source is actually going back to everyday Canadians, First Nations communities, and most of it is being shipped to international markets where the companies are reaping profits because Canada has negotiated such small, minuscule royalties for these operations. So this actually has very little benefit to the Canadian economy or the everyday Canadian via economics or energy, meeting the energy needs of our country. This is simply for the growth and expansion of corporations, multinational corporations, and that is the bottom line, which begs to pose the question, why is there so much political support behind these things? And you start to see the direct correlation between state and oil and gas. And unfortunately, we live in a system that's sort of morally bankrupt and corrupt. And we have corporations. But the foundations of this country are founded on a corporate profiteering and model. I mean, the Hud Bay Company is a private corporation that basically helped colonize all of Canada. History is repeating itself here with oil and gas, whether it's tar sands or fracking or uranium mining or so on and so forth. This isn't simply just about tar sands, but this is about the fact that, communities, ecosystems, and people who are interconnected with those ecosystems are suffering at the hands of corporate greed.
And people don't want to hear this. Unfortunately, it can sound so conspiracy-ish. Do you know what I mean? Like it's like we can't even talk about capitalism anymore. We can't be against capitalism anymore. It sounds naive, right? I think
just one thing. It's not conspiracy theory, though.
Yeah.
The Minister of Mining in Alberta sat on the board of Syncrude. At the same time, Syncrude is the largest operator in Alberta's tar sands. She was a paid board member of Syncrude, the largest operator, and was in charge of mining approvals. I'm not talking conspiracy theory. This is like blatantly in our faces. And people tried to call out the Alberta government on conflict of interest, and they were just like, no, there isn't. She brings her expertise as someone in the oil and gas sector to her job as a minister of mining and whatever, I can't remember what it was called. But like this is the complicity and corruption between multinational corporations and individual leaders in our sort of conventional democratic government leaders.
Because often when somebody's done politics, they go straight into industry afterwards. So there's a direct
or industry politics
love thing happening there. One thing you said too is about the where the economics is actually taking place. A lot of people don't realize, even with the hydro projects, oil projects. I keep bringing up other industries as well. That the fact that the government isn't making very much money, Canadians aren't making very much money from that, and the oil industry, like Exxon, is the one company that has made the most money in all of history for any money to be made by any company. So we're talking massive amounts of dough for these industries, but it goes directly into the pockets of those corporations and not into Canadians' pockets. So the whole economy argument is bunk.
And First Nations, we don't actually receive any direct royalties. None. And there's this really big misconception that First Nations receive royalties from these projects. We don't. Any financial benefit that we get from the industry is negotiated between our nations and the industries through two different ways. One is called IBAs, which is Impact Benefit Agreement, where the company agrees that they are impacting our treaty rights and therefore accommodate us for those impacts. So it's an admission to the violation of our rights and then paying us for those violations. Because their position is, we already have the approvals from the government. Like, we can't just, stop operations. So what is it going to take for us to come to an agreement? And this is how these negotiations really take place. And the second one is through business contracts. So many First Nations, including my own, have a series of different types of businesses, operations. So we're entrepreneurs just like anybody else. And my nation has a bunch of different businesses. We don't run oil and gas operations. We have a catering company and a janitorial service and a recycling service and a mechanical shop and a welding company. But unfortunately, fortunately, I don't know, some of our largest business partners or customers are oil and gas industry. So government, a lot of the time, my nation went on tour with Neil Young last year, and they're like, isn't it true that your nation made $200 million from blah, 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 blah? And we're like, well, we may have our business might have had $200 million worth of contracts, but after all the costs, it's nowhere near $200 million. And it wasn't directly, it's not like the company said, here's $200 million, do whatever you want with it. Like, we employ 3,000 people with my nation, and they're not my members. I think there's literally 56 members of my nation employed under the 3,000 people that are employed under our business group. So everyday Canadians are making that money, not my nation. And there's this big misconception where they try to move money around and make it look like they're giving so much money to First Nations and that we're getting so much benefit from it. But the direct actual benefits are almost zero to First Nations communities, whether it's fracking, whether it's hydro, whether it's tar sands.
And I think our nations are the first ones to feel the negative impacts of those industries as well. Amanda, you sort of started to touch on the connection between violence against women and violence against the land, and I kind of want to jump in there before we open it up to the floor.
Yeah, sure. Well, like even just like that conversation of the first ones to feel the negative impacts of industry. And so like whether it's through like proximity to like, because like it's just kind of like if you're, I think it's just kind of like if you work in the industry, the oil industry, and I've heard this from people who worked like in the tar sands, and they're like telling me that like the man camps are almost like that they're worse than prison, because you're out in this like rural situation and you like live in this tiny little trailer, and like literally you're just like working in oil fields the entire day, like, and then you just come back and you just do, and you have all of this money. And so what you see like a lot of the time, like what is like in the back in oil fields or like near like any major like fracking operation, or like when they come to like build new infrastructure, they bring in their workers, and like this directly impacts like all kinds of different things, but like specifically like Indigenous women, and like we've seen like increased rates of like HIV positivity, and also like increased use of like different types of substances and increased abuse of different substances, and there's like continued like, and because there's like a lack of support for sex workers to be able to work safely on their own terms and screen their clients, there's like also like increased like violence against sex workers, and so like, and like as well as like just increased assault amongst like anyone, like, and especially sex workers too. And so like these things are all intertwined, but then also like there's a conversation, about like like in Haudenosaunee like worldview, in terms of like bringing in new life, there's like the view is that like the womb is like the first environment that we're ever in. Obviously, I mean, duh, it seems very obvious, but it actually implicates so much, because like, all of the things that we absorb as human beings, like toxins and things like that, are going to be like hyper concentrated in the womb and also in breast milk. So whoever's carrying a child or like choosing to breastfeed their child, like you see like a huge, like, because a lot of these contaminants, all these carcinogens, and things like this, that like cause like major, like, because like you don't understand, like these are neurotoxins that are actually in the water. Like it's not just like oh, it's like a bad pollutant. Like what does that mean? It's like these are neurotoxins, they're carcinogens, they cause cancer, they can cause like complications in birth, as well as like really impact how people's like even DNA can reproduce, and so that way our cells know what to do, and so like these things are really important, and they directly impact like reproductive justice. And so like the free choice to want to raise your child in your own traditional homelands in a traditional way can also result in like allowing yourself and your child to be subject to like all kinds of contamination, like if you're eating traditional food from your own lands, and so like this is a direct way that again, like there's intergenerational violence like right there, that's like a result of colonization. But also too, like I'm just gonna draw attention to my awesome shirt. It's art by Erin Marie Consmo, like ERINMARIE-KONSMO, if you want to check her out. She works with the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, who has really supported Reclaim Turtle Island in the last like while, and like this, and this piece is called Land is Ceremony. And like as Ongwahoe, as original people, like our language, our culture, our teachings, our ways of being and doing like come from our relationship with the land. And when that relationship is also hurt, then like we see that our communities are hurt, and like whether that's like interpersonal, because like another thing that we've been talking about, like some youth, two-spirit youth, I guess, queers of kinds, we've been talking about like land trauma and how that impacts us, like our psychological and emotional and spiritual well-being when we see our lands being harmed, and how that makes us want to harm ourselves and harm each other, and the way that land trauma also like gets caught up into the conversation around like violence against women and violence against the land, because there's no culture of consent. And if we had cultures of consent, even just in a social level, then we would assume, like, it's like if someone knocks on your door, and you open the door, and then you can ask, oh, can I come in, You would never just walk, unless you know someone really well, but you would never just walk into a stranger's house. And that's what industry does to indigenous people. There's no consent, there's no conversation, there's just drilling, there's just penetration. It's really graphic and it's really violent, and it's anomalous with, it's like it's co-created with sexual violence, and the ways that there's this lack of consent, and there's just like this attack, this assumption that your body. A piece of art I was going to have up was another piece by Aaron, but it's called "Our Bodies Are Not Terra Nullis," and that our bodies are not empty vessels waiting to be colonized, and that's like a lot of these like ideas like come together. In terms of like the relationship that we have culturally, but also spiritually with the land, and also like, but those things aren't separate from a material relationship either, and so it's like it's all co-created. And so yeah, for me the main thing is like the conversation around like consent and how things that carry such power, like, or people's power, is not actually being acknowledged or valued, and the way that we see, like, in a culture where we consume Mother Earth, we can hit women, we can beat our children, where like, and also too, like, it's not even, and it's like the majority of violence against indigenous women is by white men, and in fact, it's not even just by white men, it's by the police. It's like the Vancouver Police Department, the RCMP.
Despite what the RCMP says right now.
Despite, of course, you can't have a murder investigate itself,
Yeah.
Anyway, but and so like there's these historical and contemporary relationships that like form how this violence is experienced, and it's because of like this project of settler colonialism and who's a desirable settler, and like what are the types of societies that we want to have here. It's like even like the head tax that they had of like anyone who's Oriental trying to immigrate to Canada, like they didn't, for the longest time they just wouldn't let you, because they wanted Euros, they wanted white Europeans, they didn't want anyone else. And so these are things we have to, like, it's all together, they're not separate things.
I would go, just to second what you're saying, I am just in my own thinking and research and whatever, I think all earth-based societies treat women better, period. Especially when they have a understanding of the connection between the earth and all the other beings and ourselves. And so when you have a society that is based in capital and abstraction and rationalism, you have always more violence against women. I would just say that outright. And if you look at the violence of colonization, the way in which the society that was suppressing the one that they arrived at largely attacks the women first. And we can see this in contemporary wars, right? The use of rape as a tactic of war. And I think that a lot of people like to think of it in the past, but this lack of consent, a culture that sanctions another culture's inability to say yes or no. Like, as an entire society, we do not have the right to say yes or no in this country. And so that's going to come out in the day-to-day relations with Indigenous women.
Yeah.
It's like the society tells men every day that we have no right to say yes or no. That's going to come out everywhere and all the time.
Exactly.
I think, a really good thing to also point out is that sometimes people they feel a little, I would say, butthurt when you say things like, when you talk about like Indigenous women and like white people are like taking away our power, but I think that the cycles of oppression have also really hurt our communities in the sense that we have and we continue to perpetuate these types and these forms of colonization and oppression through internalized oppression. And our own men are devaluing the lives of Indigenous women. A
Some.
Native,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying our own men, like it's not, this is a systemic problem that devalues certain people. And then through the patriarchal sort of colonial systems, women become even less. So you have Indigenous people as less, and then Indigenous women at an even lower standard. And so when you have these industrialized projects in these areas where, you know, the feminine, which is Mother Earth, and the river systems, which almost in any earth-based culture are feminine, are desecrated with no regard. And it's an endemic part of these systems of the industrialization of Mother Earth and the feminine. And one other thing too is that, you know, you've mentioned PTSD, like this trauma, and some new studies have come out to say that many of, not just the direct Indigenous people who went to residential school, but the next generation are suffering from PTSD. And it's not just PTSD about being in a residential school, it's about PTSD of being ripped and removed from our landscapes, our mothers, our places of life, our life givers, the destruction and desecration of those places. I was backstage and I was talking about how I wasn't in my traditional territory for 10 years. And in the 10 years is when the tar sands expanded like tenfold. And I went there, and my aunt, who had become so desensitized by the development because she lived there the whole time, was like, oh my God, you should see it. It's so crazy. It's big now. And she's like, oh, and we're driving through the region where we used to hold our healing walk. And she's just like, blah, 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 blah. It's so big. Yeah, they're doing this and that. And as we sort of get past this little peak area, and all you see is just literally destruction, like tailings ponds and billowing. It looks like Mordor. Like it sounds cheesy to say, but it looks like Mordor. And we get past this point, and I can see it, and I was like, it was like witnessing. And every time I say this, sometimes it was like witnessing a dead relative. It was like seeing someone ripped apart in front of you. These are the places of my ancestry. These are the places I knew as a child. These are the places where we picked medicine and went hunting and went fishing. They are an intrinsic part of who I am. And to see them just destroyed with such little regard, it was a direct trauma to me and to who I am as a Dene Su'ulene woman. And I don't think that people quite get that. And for me, I didn't realize that most people don't have that connection to the land. And it seems like such a foreign concept that you don't have that connection to places. Like that, I sometimes have a lot of empathy for settler populations here because you're so far away from home. And you're so far removed from the places that gave your people life. You're the reasons why your hair is light, or your eyes are blue, or your skin is a certain way. It's because those places gave you those things through the genetic makeup of centuries and generations of people. And that earth, those landscapes, gave you the way that you look, just like we have. And so here we are defending, we are at the front lines, holding on to that connection. Because frankly, I think that connection is going to be what saves this planet as we enter into climate chaos and climate destruction. We're searching for a way for climate stabilization, and it's going to come from reconnecting with those places of being and knowing.
Woohoo! I think that's a good place to open it to. I'm like tearing up here and like feeling like I'm going to just run out with a sledgehammer. I would like to open it up to all of you to have an opportunity to ask questions as you have been listening. And I'm sure there are bits and pieces floating around in your brain. And don't worry about how you sound. Just speak from your heart and you'll be fine.
Hopefully they'll be able to see you.
I can't see very well, so I'm just going to do this.
The lights are right in
Hi,
our eyes.
camera. I know it looks weird. So let's have a question. Yes, please.
I've heard is it on? Yes. I've heard that there were 25 million inhabitants in Canada before the Europeans came, and the environment was fine. So we are here, I think, 34 million now, so it's kind of the same people. Why cannot we take some ideas and technologies? Because if there were 25 million there and they were fine, and we are 34, it's like, what is the problem?
Yeah.
Is a technology thing, an innovation thing?
It's a good question. So she's asking if there were 35 million Indigenous people here then, and there's only 34 million now, why are we going so wrong?
Can I start this? Go ahead.
Take it away, baby.
So something I was thinking about in terms of like, also just in the conversation of, the violence, right? Like for Haudenosaunee and like Anishinaabe and other nations too, like the women are where we get our clans, okay? And so the women basically, they carry the nation, and so attacking the women is attack on our clans, is attack on our nations, right? And so like these perspectives, right? This idea that you can even look at the earth as a resource is a mind frame that's totally foreign to Ongohoeneha, to an indigenous way. So it's not just like about technology. It's about perspective, And so we were talking earlier about like this culture, like we talk about like as a rape culture in everyday society, and also it is a rape culture in terms of the land, and it's like no wonder that it's not just the invaders, it's not just the white men, it's also our own people, it's all kinds of people who don't view indigenous women's lives, and it's because of this process of assimilation. And it's this disconnect between the land and humanity, And so I don't think it's just like a matter of technology, It's not just like that, because there were like folks used copper, folks used minerals, like indigenous nations did actually use the earth and like relate with the earth in ways that was not destructive, because we have valued the 7 generations. Like we valued into the future, many generations to come, we're gonna have to come and live the way that we can and live in a good way. And it's not just our 7 generations, but it's the 7 generations of all the other nations around us, and like including non-human nations. And so that we like value the salmon, we value the wolf, we value the bear, we value the turtle, we value the sturgeon, we value the eel. We value all of these relatives who are actually sustaining us, and we look at them actually as our teachers, as like entities that we have a lot to learn from, because they've been doing it a lot longer than us, And so for me, it's like it's about actually a way of relating and a way of being in the world, and there's just something imperial that needs to stop, And so whether it's just a matter of consent, even on this one basic level of even if you can't possibly understand each other, because it's not easy to just, even as an indigenous person, it's not easy fully to like, because of colonization, contact, intergenerational, affects, like I'm the first person in my family since like my grandfather, like really to start, like my grandfather went to residential schools and he stopped learning, like he didn't learn, he like cut out his indigenous language, and then from there it was like a shame thing, and then like, so I'm the first one to kind of bring it back, right? And so like, even though this is happening, like it still takes like time, and it takes like community, and it takes like relating with each other and like building that strength together in order to like reemerge ourselves in indigenous ways of knowing and being that are like particular to our own histories and our own territories. And so like even if you can't as settlers understand why we're coming from the way we, or how we're coming from, our minds, like our cultures, where our thinking is, then you can at least understand the idea to ask, And then this is where like if we can start to center conversations around consent and practicing consent like with each other, but also then we can start doing that with the land. Because as indigenous people, I would never just roll up to Eriel's territory and just start chilling there.
Unless you're Cree.
Unless, true say.
Very complicated. I think us Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have a few fights in there too.
Right, it's true, but like largely, But like, you know, largely
We're
though,
not
like,
perfect.
and, you know, like we had the edge of the woods ceremony,
Yeah.
you know, so we'd be like rolling up and then we would light a fire and wait for someone to come and then be like, this is what we want to do, this is what we're trying to be here for, and then you like have informed consent. And then you go, all right, no problem, relative, come on in. Get that wild rice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being a little bit like harsh on the Cree. I mean, obviously there's animosity, but we came to agreements, you know? But it was just kind of like, hey, what are you doing here? This isn't your territory. Well, we like this territory.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of like harsh negotiations.
And they were being pushed out of their territory
Yeah,
because
exactly.
of
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like this camaraderie, but like, I don't know, it's like relatives that come and sit on your couch and you don't know when they're going to leave, you know?
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting question because I think that right now, and Amanda sort of pointed out, is there's this like resurgence of indigeneity or indigenous identity. I think even this whole like thing that's being curated through the power
Right,
plant
yeah.
is a really good demonstration of that. And as a part of that, it's about not just like reclaiming control and governance over our lands and territories, but it's reclaiming our roles and responsibilities in society. Where are our places and what are our places and spaces in the society? You know, residential schools really did a number on our people's psychological frame of mind and are the value. My nation runs on a traditional sort of colonial chief and council system that is integrated traditional governance systems because we have a elders council that actually has more say than the chief and council. So the elders council tells the chief and council what they're supposed to do. And when I started this work, you know, with my nation trying to oppose tar sands, they were very scared, the elders. And they said, we don't want to do that. You know, we just gotta like have a conversation with the government. You know, we just need to have a talk with them. Like we can't go out there because they're gonna do something to us. There is this fear in our people that we can't stand up and talk. Mm-hmm. And I kept saying, we need to stop being afraid. And it's a very, very scary role as an Indigenous person to challenge your elders. But I did. And those same elders that told me that I shouldn't have spoken up 5 years ago have told me that I'm doing a good job for our people. And they are out there standing up and speaking against this industry now. And it's a part of that decolonization process. And as a part of that, it's also the resurgence and recognition of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems and their place in helping to move us to a more symbiotic relationship with the planet. It's not perfect. Not all Indigenous people are perfect. I mean, we have some horrible Indigenous people. Just most of us are really awesome. But that comes from tactics of assimilation through the colonial process. Right. Some of our people were more assimilated, and some of us weren't. I'm lucky. I consider myself a privileged Indigenous person because I spent part of my life on the land. I'm a half a generation removed from the land. My children are the first generation in my dad's side of the family to not live on the land. That's it. You know, there's this like misconception that we're talking about ancient ways that died, you know, hundreds of years ago. Half a generation. My family was forcibly removed off of our trap line, which was in the middle of nowhere, in a cabin that was built by my dad and my grandfather by uranium companies. So there's this like total misconception. And I know people that like from up north, Fort Chip area, Fort Smith, Smith's Landing, all these northern communities, they don't know how to function in cities. They don't know how to function in urban settings because their whole life is, they don't even sit there like, oh, we have this great connection to the land, because it's just life.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Like there's this sort of like this, I don't like this Indigenous Indigenous traditional knowledge as like some sort of something that's like sort of abstract and you got to pull, but it's actually just the way that we live and how we respect the land. Like I grew up knowing that the water and the rocks and the trees and the animals were my relatives. You don't shit all over your relatives. And so that isn't
really strange.
unless you're really strange or something. And so like it's just like this idea of like a part of that resurgence and bringing those indigenous systems, knowledge systems, ideologies back into existence or play is about trying to break down those walls, trying to get those elders to be okay, to speak up, to step up, to reclaim those places that we once held as stewards and governors and people that led our communities. And it's not an easy process. And I think like Amanda and many of our new generations that are coming up and are really a demonstration that it's happening. And it's happening at a really quick rate, and it's really, really powerful. I know like in the 70s and 80s, you were ashamed to be a Native woman. I was ashamed to be Native when I was a kid. I used to tell people, when they asked me what I am, I would be like, do I tell them I'm Native? Are their parents gonna let me play with them still? And now I have a daughter that's 16 years old, and without even a second of hesitation, she's like, I'm Dene. And that is a huge, huge leaps and bounds to where Indigenous resurgence and identity is going and where it's come from as well.
And that's the other importance of the land. It's like all that knowledge comes from the land. And so if we lose it, then resurgence stops. It's very simple. We have nowhere else to go to get it. And one more question I think we can take. Elaine? That's my sister-in-law. That's my brother laughing away beside. We call them the Badgers.
You're both incredible, all three of you are incredible people to listen to, and thank you for sharing your stories tonight and knowledge. This question's for Eriel, actually. I'm just wondering if you are feeling a little more hopeful with the recent change of government in Alberta.
Yeah, you know, people ask me this question. Cautiously optimistic? Cautiously, because, you know, I mean, the NDP hasn't done well in Manitoba. The NDP isn't like some sort of like saving grace government that's going to come in and undo. Are they better than what we had for 44 years in Alberta? Yeah. What that means, and on a spectrum of better, what, like how much better? I mean, I don't know. They have made a promise to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into legislation. They have put together a team of people to try and figure out how to do that. And I just talked to a chief of staff for one of the ministerial departments to ask them what that team looks like. They don't have a single Indigenous person as part of that team. So, yeah, I'm like, and I just looked at him and I was like, oh, so we're going to just repeat the sort of same colonial patriarchal, and you guys know better. And he was like, well, and I'm like, I mean, really, come on. Like, you're not doing anything differently. What are you doing differently other than saying you're going to do things, but taking that same paternalistic, patriarchal approach that you know what's best for us? I'm like, if you're really serious about creating real, meaningful relationships with the First Nations and Aboriginal people of this province, you better get some on staff.
Yeah.
So cautiously optimistic.
And in some ways, it's not rocket science. Like, Indigenous sovereignty is not rocket science, you know? And we have all the frickin' reports. We have RCAP, we have the TRC, we have so many documents that Canada has produced. Then you have tons of Indigenous people who are willing to, you know, act on our own behalf, think on our own behalf. And so I think sometimes we plead ignorance because it, you know, that means we can not do anything for a really, really, really long time. Okay, so I think that it's late, and maybe you want to have a drink or you want to take a walk. So I would love if we could give a round of applause for Eriel and Amanda. And thank you so much.